Hello and welcome to the podcast Law for the Lay, a new game to play. I'm your host Clarissa. I'm an Australian lawyer living in the UK and taking on the entertaining challenge with guests on this show to make sense of all the laws that apply to us here on planet Earth as we navigate this game of life. Today's guest is Dr Mark Ellis. He is an international criminal law expert and the executive director of the International Bar Association. So essentially, he leads the foremost international organisation of bar associations, law firms, and individual lawyers in the world. Throughout his career, he's served as a legal advisor for some pretty hectic historical events, including the Independent International Commission on Kosovo. He was appointed as an advisor by the Organisation for Security and Cooperation in Europe for the creation of Serbia's War Crimes Tribunal. He was actively involved with the Iraqi High Tribunal. He has also advised the defence team of Nguyen Gia at the Cambodian War Crimes Tribunal. Then in 2013, he was admitted to the list of assistants to counsel of the International Criminal Court. Later, in 2015, he was appointed to the UN-created advisory panel on matters relating to defence counsel of the mechanisms for international criminal tribunals. Oh, and he's also just initiated the creation of a phone app called Eyewitness to Atrocities, which is very relevant to things going on at the moment. Now, I know this guy is impressive, but don't be scared. Although he's written and edited books, won awards and been published in the Times, I found him to be incredibly warm and approachable and has lots of wisdom we could all learn from. He is formerly known as Dr Mark Ellis, but for this podcast, he's just Mark and we're just two people having a chat about war crimes in these times. Mark, thank you so much for joining us here on Law for the Lay.
Wonderful to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Before we jump into the very serious end of this podcast, tell us, what is something silly that you love?
I'll tell you what I love, but if people hear me say that it might be silly, they'll string me up. But
oh, no.
I love fly fishing. I love fly fishing. But anybody that would hear me say I love fly fishing would just not accept that I would say it's silly too. However, it is what I love, and it is because you get lost just in the idea of fly fishing. So you're out in the rivers, there's nobody around, and nothing else is on my mind except yes, exactly. How can I put that fly to a point where I can catch a fish?
Now, Mark, without it making it more silly in this episode, do you wear the rubber overalls when you fly fish?
You must do that. And you must be able to take the fly rod in a way that even if it's not correctly being done, it looks like it's being done that way. Even though I might not catch a fish for the entire day, I'm looking good. And that's
while
really
you're
important.
Doing it.
So,
oh.
Yes. Exactly.
Here we go. That's fly
exactly
fishing.
Right.
It might be something I delve into at one point. Okay, so
it's worthwhile.
Into the meatier side of the podcast, can you explain for us what is a war crime? Because it's very important at this period of time that everyone really understands what this is.
It's a great question. It's a fundamental question because, of course, that's what's on everyone's mind right now. I think what I would do is I would look at this in two. I would separate this out because some people might confuse themselves, can be confused about what war crimes are versus the kind of the crime of aggression that we're seeing, and they are separate, but they're distinct, but very, very important. So one crime we've already seen, and that is we've witnessed this kind of crime of aggression. And that's when Russia decided to violate Ukraine's territory. And the reason I mention that and separate it out, because for me, that one act of violating Ukraine's territory is, for me, the violation of probably the most sacred principle of international law, because what you're doing is you're violating the territorial integrity, the political independence of Ukraine. And so when I think about, well, how sacred is that? International law is absolutely and without question and unyielding, I think, on this one issue. You cannot, a state cannot use threat, even any type of threat or force against another state. And international law says you can't do that because of how fundamental it is to international law. And there's only two exceptions to that rule. And we've heard about this. One, it's self-defense, and that makes sense.
Yeah.
Could you violate the territorial integrity of a country if, in fact, that country has done something, attacked you? Well, yes, you can. That's self-defense, and so you can violate the integrity of another territorial integrity of another country if you're doing so in self-defense. And the second, and this goes to the heart of international law, is the UN Security Council can always authorize the use of force against another state. It has the authority to do that, and that's the exception that would be given to Russia, for instance. But we know in this case, as in many cases, neither of those exceptions apply. And in the end, what we've witnessed is this kind of egregious violation of what I say is the most sacred principle of international law, and that's the crime of aggression. So if we bifurcate it, that's the first crime that we've committed. Now you look into the principle that deals with what's happening right now on ground, that's taking place in the conflict. And this is where you find war crimes. So you shift over and you say, well, once the conflict starts, international law, in a very unique way, says there are certain rules that parties have to follow. You have to abide by rules. And I think for many people, they would think, well, that's a bit absurd that you have rules in war.
Yeah, but they're already breaking some rules.
Exactly. They've in this case, my point would be Russia has already violated and committed the crime of aggression, has violated that principle. Now you're inside the war. You're and that's where war crimes, as you asked, are relevant. And many people will have heard of the Geneva Conventions. And the Geneva Conventions, there are other treaties, other conventions that apply, but the Geneva Conventions are the best known. And what the Geneva Conventions do is they set out certain rules, and that you can't violate those rules. Now, I've always, when I think of war crimes, when people think of war crimes as well, there are a number of different, if you will, categories that deal with POWs, they deal with the types of weapons. But for me, and relevant to what's happening in Russia, it is the absolute prohibition against targeting civilians or civilian objects. You can't indiscriminately shell areas of civilians. You can't target hospitals. You can't use weapons like cluster bombs that we've seen being used. You can't displace people. All of these are war crimes, and there's many more, but those are kind of fundamental crimes that one would look at and say, all right, in the theater of battle, the international community says some acts are simply not permitted, and therefore they constitute war crimes. And this is what we're looking at now. So it's part of a two-sided international law coin. One part is the act of the aggression, which we have seen, and the other is what's happening during the war, which we are witnessing now. Those are the two.
Okay. So in terms of what the Geneva Conventions would permit as like acceptable behavior within war times, would it be soldiers on soldiers fighting within a designated area? Is that something that's okay in that circumstance?
Correct. That's correct. So if they call combatants, if one party is targeting or fighting combatants on the other side, that's permissible. Now there are even some limitations on, for instance, how you treat combatants, like prisoners of war. There's a whole convention about how you deal with that. But generally, you're absolutely right that the Geneva Conventions recognize that that conflict between combatants, between military forces of two countries, in this case Russia and Ukraine, that is permissible. That unfortunately is what conflict or war is about. But the Geneva Conventions in relations to civilians and war crimes that are being committed tend to be ones directed at civilians. This is why the international community is focused so much on protecting civilians in a conflict. But between combatants, no, that's a fairly wide open prospect.
Okay, so in terms of, I guess, contextualizing at what's happening at the moment, how do we internationally hold people accountable, both as individuals and as countries, for war crimes when they're committed?
That is the.
It's a long piece of string.
That is the question. Yeah, it is, because even the idea of international criminal law, which is what we are talking about here, being able to recognize, identify war crimes that are being committed or other violations of international law. Your question is the key question. Well, if those violations have occurred, how do you hold those individuals or countries accountable? And I think in answer to that, I'll go back to what I tried to bifurcate the two main crimes that we're witnessing here to give a sense of how we might go about this. So I mentioned the crime of aggression, which is that first violation that has occurred.
So Russia invading Ukraine? Is the
Russia invading Ukraine. That is. And when I speak of crime of aggression, and we talk about Russia, but ultimately international criminal law is about individuals. And so you're always looking at, well, who's culpable? Who's the individual in charge? Who has initiated or planned these attacks? Who's overseeing these attacks? Who has effective control? And of course, everyone wants to know, does Vladimir Putin check that box? And I have no doubt that in relations to the crime of aggression, the international community will focus on Mr. Putin as the architect of the crime of aggression, and then perhaps even part of the overseeing what the military apparatus that's committing the crimes now in conflict. So if you go back to this crime of aggression, some people talk about, well, the International Criminal Court. Why don't they focus their attention on the crime of aggression? And the International Criminal Court, or the ICC, does have as part of its statutory focus the crime of aggression. It also has war crimes and crimes against humanity, genocide, but crime of aggression is there. But it has some limitations, and so there's structural or statutory limitations as to when that crime when the ICC can move and have focus on that crime, who the ICC can target on that crime. And because there's statutory limitations on this, Russia cannot be a target for the ICC for the crime of aggression. So the ICC will not have jurisdiction over Russia on the crime of aggression, simply because there are just statutory limitations within it's called the Rome Statute, which is the statute of the ICC. Because there are limitations on this particular crime, Russia finds itself outside that net. And so therefore the international community has to look somewhere else. And your audience has probably heard discussions about, well, there needs to be a new judicial mechanism. If the ICC can't handle the crime of aggression that occurred by Russia, and Mr. Putin particularly, then there needs to be another mechanism. And generally there's three discussions going on. One is, well, let's create a Nuremberg type trial. As we know, Nuremberg was created after World War II, and they tried individuals for, in essence, the crime of aggression. It was called crime against peace, but it was similar. So that's one way of doing it. Two, You could have a purely domestic mechanism. Ukraine could certainly on its own decide that it's going to pursue the crime of aggression against Mr. Putin. There are some limitations on that, jurisdictional limitations, but that would be one. Third is a hybrid approach. So Ukraine would ask the international community to assist them and do it together, so that you have Ukrainians involved and international players involved. And that, for me, is probably the best approach, because I think it's really important for this crime of aggression to have international involvement with it. It shouldn't just be Ukraine going after Mr. Putin or others for the crime of aggression. It's such an egregious act that I think the international community should do it.
Hold them accountable.
So, exactly. That's the crime of aggression. And then for the war crimes, that I think is pretty well in the heart of the International Criminal Court. Now, here too, Russia is not a state party to the Rome Statute, which is the ICC, the International Criminal Court. So it hasn't signed up, because the ICC is a court where you become a state party, and to gain jurisdiction, to accept the jurisdiction, you opt in. Exactly. But under the ICC's jurisdiction, a country that's not a member state, not a state party, but a country that violates or commits crimes on a state party or on another state, where the ICC's jurisdiction is valid, then that country can be, in essence, brought into the ICC's jurisdiction. And that's what's happened in Ukraine right now. Russia's not a state party. And Ukraine, back in 2014, in essence said, after the Crimea annexation, asked the ICC to take jurisdiction over any future crimes that might be committed on their territory. The ICC accepted that. So even though the Ukraine is not a full state party, they've not signed the Rome Statute, they have accepted the ICC's jurisdiction over crimes being committed on their territory in Ukraine. And that would include crimes that are being committed right now. And that's why the ICC prosecutor announced last month that he was proceeding with an investigation. He said, I think that there's a reasonable basis to believe that the crimes are being committed in Ukraine, and I'm going to investigate. And the ICC has the legal ability to do that, and that's what they're doing. So those are the two main avenues, I think, on your question about, well, how do you bring people to account? I think it's through those two mechanisms that will happen. Not to say it won't be difficult, it will be challenging, but I can imagine those are the two that you're going to do it.
So just so I've got a good understanding of it, does it essentially mean that if war crimes are committed against a Ukrainian in Russia, that's going to be difficult to hold people accountable because Russia's not a party to that agreement? But if there's war crimes committed in Ukraine, on Ukraine territory, by whoever comes into the country and commits war crimes, because they're a party and they're within the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court, does that mean that they are sort of protected in a way, and anyone that has committed a crime can be prosecuted against?
Exactly. And it's your last point that's the crucial one here, because it's one that can be seen as a bit odd. But you're absolutely right. If a non-state party, in this case Russia, commits crimes in Ukraine, and there's evidence that that's occurring, then by the very fact that Ukraine is seen as a, if you will, kind of a partial state party, they haven't signed it up, but they've asked, and the ICC indicated that they will take jurisdiction over crimes in their territory, then that's exactly what it is. And remember, any country has this ability to do that. If in your country, if anybody commits a crime, then that person or that state becomes liable for that crime. So it makes sense here that the ICC would still have jurisdiction over crimes that are being committed in Ukraine. I might add a point, though, that the ICC, when they opened up an investigation, I indicated the prosecutor has done that. The prosecutor will look at both sides. They're called situations, and so he's going to be looking at the situation in Ukraine. And if it means that he has seen evidence where Ukrainian military forces have committed war crimes, for instance, then he will pursue that as well. So far, we've seen an overwhelming evidence of war crimes being committed by Russian troops. But I think it's important for people to understand that the ICC looks at it as a whole, and they look at the situation, and therefore they'll, if there were evidence that crimes were committed on the Ukrainian side, they would pursue that as well.
So on that, if someone got hold of Putin himself and pulled him over the border onto Ukraine and said, we're going to hold you here, you naughty man, until someone can deal with you, is it still the statutory limitation on aggression applying here? But if Putin, as he goes into Ukraine, does something naughty and commits a war crime, can we get him on that second one where it's no statutory limitation?
Great question. So first, in the sense of a crime of aggression, the ICC doesn't have that jurisdiction, but other mechanisms could have it, and Ukraine undoubtedly has it. So if Mr. Putin walks over to Ukraine and he's arrested, he's apprehended, he's arrested, the question, would Ukraine have jurisdiction over the crime of aggression against Mr. Putin? The answer is two parts. One is yes, because from a statutory point of view, Ukraine, I believe, would have that ability to do that under their own legislation. But this is why it's such a good question. There is still a limitation. And international law has, international law has this very firm protection against sitting heads of states, and so a state, regardless of the state, let's say it's Australia, New Zealand, the UK, what have you, decides we're going to go after Mr. Putin for any crime, and we're going to haul them into our court, whether it's in Ukraine or the UK. Mr. Putin, under international law, would be immune from prosecution.
Wow.
Because
why is that?
Because there is a long customary law principle that protects and provides immunity for leaders, political leaders at that level. And the reason it exists is because it makes sense. It exists because you couldn't continue to have diplomacy if the head of state of one state decided to visit another state, and all of a sudden could be hauled into the court of that state, kidnap them in it, even though there might be reasons to do that. The argument is that diplomacy, state interaction would fall, that you can't, it wouldn't survive. And because of that, the longstanding principle is that, in this case, head of state immunity, an incumbent head of state is immune from being pulled into another country's court for whatever reason on this. But, and this is where the pendulum swings again, but that head of state immunity doesn't exist for international tribunals. It doesn't exist for the ICC or for tribunals that we know existed for Yugoslavia, Rwanda. In their statutes, it says we do not recognize head of state immunity. And therefore, if we want to pursue a head of state for crimes that are under the ICC statute, war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide, we can do that. It does not matter that you're head of state. And if you recall, that's where the President al-Bashir from Sudan, he was indicted. he was a sitting head of state. It doesn't matter with the ICC. So getting back to your question, it depends on who has the jurisdiction. If the ICC were to decide to pursue Mr. Putin, not for crime of aggression, because we've already decided that doesn't happen. But if the ICC pursues Mr. Putin for war crimes, under the concept, there's a concept called command responsibility, and he was apprehended, Mr. Putin would not have this head of state immunity on him. That the ICC has the ability to bring him to justice if they apprehended him. So it's a great question because it opens up this odd distinction in law that there's separate ways of doing this. And one side, with the international tribunals like the ICC, there's no prohibition at all to go after a sitting head of state. But on the other side of the coin, if a third state decided to do that, to try to pull Mr. Putin into their jurisdiction, for whatever reason, they wouldn't be able to do that. Not while he's a sitting head of state, they couldn't do it.
Am I correct in knowing that there's no police force for the International Criminal Court? So they can't just get a search warrant for Putin and go and, get him by the scruff of the neck and drag him over and trial him.
You're absolutely right. This is one of the real hurdles for international justice. The ICC, the International, doesn't have a police force. It doesn't have a military. It is dependent solely on the cooperation of nation states. If there's an arrest warrant from the ICC, they require, or they rely on the international community to assist in arresting, apprehending, and transferring the individual to The Hague. And that's how it's structured, and that, by your very question, opens up one of the weaknesses that exist, and that's enforceability. But I'm not sure there's any other way of doing it other than to reinforce the responsibility that all states have to ensure that those who have committed these types of heinous crimes are brought to justice. That's really, I think, the responsibility of all states.
Wow, it's quite poetic, isn't it? Like, strength in numbers creates better justice. But I guess it's room for innovation. And that brings me on to my last question for you, because in this context of using both Russia and Ukraine as a case study against previous war crimes that have been committed, particularly, up against when you were mentioning like the Nuremberg trials, and how many Nazis, weren't held accountable for their crimes well into their 90s. That's a long period of time to wait for the administration of justice for war crimes committed by certain individuals. So in terms of now, in this day and age, 2022, do you think it's going to be quicker to hold people accountable for war crimes committed in this Russia-Ukraine conflict because of technology, greater surveillance, or do you foresee there's going to be problems in this space moving forward?
I think one probably needs to look at this in the sense of your question about kind of holding an individual account. I think that would be a distinction between indicting somebody. So the judicial process works fast enough to where we're not talking about years down the road, but we're talking about something much quicker for an indictment. And yes, I do think the indictments, even though in the past tribunals, including the ICC, have taken, to me, a significant amount of time, more than I thought that was required in order to secure an indictment. I think they become more efficient now. I think the ICC is more efficient. So I think you'll have the indictments in a much faster way, as you're suggesting. Okay. But of course, the other side of that coin is the apprehension. As you alluded to earlier, for justice really to occur, you have to have those individuals who have been indicted be brought to justice, and that means they have to be transferred, in this case, to The Hague. That's a much more challenging, much more difficult hurdle. But I think that in this particular scenario in Ukraine, I have never in my professional life seen or heard more people in more countries talk about accountability and justice as I have.
Okay.
And it's almost an awakening of the importance of international law and the importance of accountability. I think that's a very powerful force, and I think that that will help accelerate this process of not only indictments but hopefully apprehension. But remember this. I always say this too, that international criminal law for me plays the long game. So there's no statute of limitations for crimes of these nature, of genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity. It's not as if in 5 years that runs out. They never run out. There's no statute of limitations. So
Okay.
if we can't get the perpetrator today, then we're going to try to get him tomorrow. And if not tomorrow, then next month. If not next month, next year. But what international
You
criminal
can
law
run,
does
but you
say
can't hide.
is that these crimes, exactly, you can run, but you can't hide, because these are the most egregious crimes. These atrocity crimes are the most egregious crimes in international affairs and international criminal law, and therefore the entire international community has said these crimes must be, those who perpetrate these crimes must be brought to justice, and eventually they will be brought to justice. And I think that's important to note.
That's great. And just for the benefit of, I'm conscious that many people in our audience may not actually know the difference between an indictment and an apprehension. Would you mind just explaining a little bit about them both, just for anyone who's missed that?
Yeah. So the indictment, what the prosecutor will do is that what he's trying to do now is to suggest that there's again reasonable basis to investigate, which he has done, and then there's going to be a sufficient evidence to secure an indictment, and he'll get that indictment from a pretrial chamber at the ICC. And what he's just trying to do is to kind of set kind of a prima facie case. He's saying, listen, here's all the evidence we have that suggests that whether it's Mr. Putin under command responsibility or military leaders or military personnel have committed these crimes. And we're going to seek an indictment, i.e., therefore an arrest warrant for these individuals. It doesn't mean that they're guilty, because every individual, regardless of their status, requires a defense and can defend himself. And that's what would happen once the individual is arrested, apprehended, and brought, then the trial process goes. But the indictment is the first step. The investigation is the first step, which is occurring. The indictment would be the second, and then the trial, assuming the individual is apprehended, would be the third and final.
Okay. And with the indictment, just to reiterate for our audience, that's when you're innocent until proven guilty, and it's at the end of that process where they decide whether you're guilty of crimes of war or not.
Yes, exactly. It's just saying that there's sufficient evidence there to believe that the individual has committed the crimes. It's just like any prosecutor in a state, in a nation, or in your locale. It's the same process that occurs, but in the end, you still have to have an adjudication of guilt or innocence, and that requires the opportunity and the right of individuals to defend themselves, and that's absolutely true. That's absolutely should be the case, because in the end, you don't want any doubt that the individual who you've alleged have committed these war crimes have in fact done so. You want there to be no doubt about that, and that requires a strong, robust trial process.
Absolutely, and well needed. Mark, one last thing. You have a very impressive career, but you have been involved in initiating a phone app called Eyewitness to Atrocities. Would you mind explaining to our audience what this is and what it does?
Yeah, and thank you for that question, because it's playing such an important role right now in Ukraine. The Eyewitness to Atrocities app is, I think, technology at its best. I mean, we're seeing a war here in Ukraine that I think will be the most documented war in history.
Mm.
And much of that documentation is coming from technology that I think has kind of fundamentally changed the way we learn about a war, the way we watch war, and technology is providing that through the internet, through television. What's happening is this kind of the awareness that's occurring. It's because we're seeing everything live on social media, on television. That's technology. That's the smartphone. That's everything that's occurring. And to me, that's really important because it raises the awareness and profile of what's happening. But the real problem is very little of this, that the pictorial, whether it's videos or pictures that we're seeing on YouTube or in social media, and they're uploaded on their sites. But the problem is very little of it can be used in a court of law because you have to verify the authenticity of the photographs and videos coming in. You have to have a chain of custody. If you're in a court of law, you've got to have the person who's taking the picture or video and saying, this is when I took it, this is where I was. All this needs to be to occur, and you need to ensure that the pictures or the videos were not tampered. Because if you're watching things that are on YouTube, you don't know. They could very well be altered, and oftentimes they are. And so the Eyewitness app was designed to fill that gap, to resolve that issue.
Okay.
And so this app that is downloaded on the phone and then used in a conflict area in taking pictures of videos, all of that metadata, where it was being taken, when it was being taken, are there satellites, stations around, and can you assure that it can't be tampered with, that it can't be altered? All of that can be done with this app.
Wow.
And so when somebody's taking videos or pictures, then that is sent into a vault. It's sent into it's held by LexisNexis, which is a huge player in security in the world and with law. And so all that comes in, that the videos and pictures, and sits in that vault. And a copy is made so that the individual or groups that are using the app can do what they want with it. But once we get to a point of a prosecution in the ICC or another mechanism, this original footage can be brought out and presented in court, and we don't need to even know who took the picture. We don't need that, or who took the video. Because all we need to know is where, when, has it been tampered with, can we authenticate the veracity of what's being taken. And by doing that, that video, that picture speaks for themselves. You can enter that into evidence. And that's a game changer in these conflict areas, because of everything we're witnessing in Ukraine, with all of the horrendous atrocities being committed. The evidence needs to be collected so that in the end you're able to present a case that says these are the crimes that are being committed. And you have to do so in a way that you can trust and verify the information that's being presented to the court. And this is what the Eyewitness to Atrocities Act does.
Wow, that is an incredible use of law and technology combined. Is it something that, I guess, if we've got connections with people in Ukraine, we should be encouraging them to download the app and things like that? Is there marketing campaigns behind it yet, and how to use it?
Yeah, all of that is in existence. One can go to the Eyewitness to Atrocities website and they can see all that. Or this is a project from the International Bar Association, so you can go to the IBA's website too. And yes, it's being it is being used aggressively right now in Ukraine. It will continue to be used, I think, particularly as it allows more people to take pictures and videos. So there are a number of other things that are occurring. And as I say, technology, I think, is playing a major role right now in capturing the evidence through videos or pictures that will be used in a court of law. And the Eyewitness Project is one of those, and I think a very important one. So all of this gets back to your point about, well, will this help accelerate the accountability process? And the answer for me is yes, absolutely it will.
Oh, that's incredible. Well done, Mark, on initiating that. It's just nice to know that these things are existing and we're only going to build on them from here. So well done. And thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us today. It has been an absolute pleasure, and I hope you enjoy your fly fishing.
Thank you. I will. I'll try to escape the chaos.
When you're done saving the world,
do
Mark.
that. But I really, yeah. Well, I really enjoyed this, and thank you very much for inviting me. And I hope it helps people understand and be aware of the importance of international law, and I think why we need to protect it. So that's wonderful that you're doing this. So thank you so much for inviting me.
Thank you. I couldn't agree more. Thanks for joining us here at Law for the Lay. If you enjoyed this episode, I'd love for you to swing it around your social circles, and feel free to connect with me on Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube at Law for the Lay. I'm always open to your feedback and content suggestions. Please also remember this disclaimer that no Law for the Lay content should be taken as legal advice. This is simply general information intended for educative purposes. Laws change all the time, and your personal circumstances may apply differently to what is discussed. So always do your research and contact a legal professional if you need assistance. In the meantime, look after yourself, look after each other, and let's have a good time.